Let me ask you a quick question. Do you know the difference between Charles the First and James the Second, or James the First and Charles the Second? Do you even know why these people are important, or why these 13 monarchs and rulers of England that we're going to be summarizing are important? Probably not, because you may have a case of too many monarchs, and I'm here to help you sort them all out. Start with Henry VII. Now, why do we care about Henry VII? Because Henry VII was the first to establish the Tudor dynasty after he defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. But here's the big deal about Henry VII, and that is it was during his reign that England first laid claim to America. Well, not America as we understand it today, but it was this English claim that led to future English colonization that eventually led to the freest and greatest country on planet Earth. So let's pick up a little bit more of this story. Already know about Henry VIII. You probably recall, oh, isn't he the guy with the 6 wives? Yes, he is. But where is he important in our story? Well, he's important in our story because he is the first king of England to break from the Roman Catholic Church. Now, he does this for all the wrong reasons, and that's a long story, but the result is that Henry has separated from the Roman Catholic Church, forms his own semi-Protestant Church of England, or the Anglican Church, and in the process commissions the printing of the Great Bible, which is the first legally authorized English Bible in English history, and that is a big deal. Now, there's not a lot to say about Edward VI, but he is the successor to Henry VIII, and he came to the throne when he was 9 or 10 and died when he was 15 or 16, and he, while he didn't last very long, he was a strongly Protestant king, and he had a hand in choosing his successor, Lady Jane Grey. What about Lady Jane Grey? Well, she didn't last long. She was queen for 9 days, so not a whole lot to say about her. But she was seen as the one who was usurping the throne that rightfully belonged to Mary I. And most everybody in England thought Mary deserved the throne because she was a direct descendant of Henry VIII, and Lady Jane Grey wasn't, and Edward chose her because she was Protestant and Mary was Catholic. So everybody tends to go with Mary. She's up next. Well, Mary Tudor, Mary the First of England, and you're wondering, oh, is she the one that's remembered as Bloody Mary? She is. Why? Because she had about 300 Protestants burned at the stake. That's why. She determined that she was going to impose Catholicism by force on England, and that left a bad taste in the mouth of a lot of Englishmen, and that's going to have repercussions later on down the road, but very important to your personal liberty and freedom that you enjoy as an American. Here we are with Elizabeth I, and a few things about her that touch on our story. Elizabeth never married, and she never had any children, and so she was referred to as the Virgin Queen. And during her reign, the territory of Virginia was named after her in what would later become the United States. Now, the Virginia territory was a huge chunk of North America, far larger than the current state of Virginia. But today, the state of Virginia and West Virginia do bear her name, even though West Virginia wasn't really carved out until 1863 or thereabouts. She is unusually tolerant for her era, And for someone who reigned in the late 16th century, early 17th century, she favored Protestants, but she had some tolerance for Catholics. So there was some allowance for religious freedom during her reign. Another big deal, it was during her reign that Philip II of Spain put together this massive fleet called the Spanish Armada to attack and to subdue England and to force them into Catholicism. And the fleet was turned back in the English Channel by Sir Francis Drake. And then once the Spanish fleet went out of the Channel, they were destroyed by a very, very unexpected hurricane, very rare weather conditions for that region of the world. And that was the end of the Spanish Armada. And from 1588 onward, Spain's grip on North America is slowly beginning to slip away. And that's important because Spain is not going to be a significant obstacle to English colonization of North America, or as it otherwise might have been. And that's a big deal because, hey, what's our language? What's our law? What's our history? It's mostly English. Okay, so what's the big deal about James the First? Well, a quirky thing is that he was actually already King of Scotland, and so when James comes to the throne, he is James the First of England and James the Sixth of Scotland, and so he is the beginner of a new dynasty, the Stuart dynasty. The Tudor dynasty died out with the end of Elizabeth I, and now the Stuart dynasty is in power. This is the James after whom the King James Version of the Bible is named. It was he who commissioned a group of scholars to put together what is probably the best known English translation of the scriptures. And another important thing is it is during his reign that colonization of North America begins under Englishmen who are Protestant. And that's a big deal, which we'll get to shortly. But the colony of Jamestown is established in 1607, and just a little bit later in 1620, the Plymouth colony is founded. And each of these colonies has their own story and their own ups and downs and their own trials and tribulations. But the big deal is that the center part of North America is being settled by Protestants who bring with them certain ideas of religious and civil government. And those are all very important in forming our story and our government and what we believe about religious freedom, too. Okay, well, what about Charles I? How is he important? Well, Charles I was one who believed very, very strongly in, this is going to amaze you, but he believed very, very strongly in the right of kings to rule by divine authority. And so he had little need in his mind for parliament. He often dismissed parliaments and on one occasion ruled for 11 years without a parliament ever meeting. That is the equivalent of a president having the power to fire Congress and just send the House of Representatives and the Senate home because he's tired of looking at them. Now, the president does not have that power. And one of the reasons is your founding fathers knew their English history, and they didn't want a president with the power of Charles I, or with the tendency to abuse that power. During the reign of Charles I, English rights were trampled upon, and people had, at certain times, no rights. You had no right to protect yourself, no right to your property, and ministers operating in the king's name could seize anything that they wanted from you. So the representatives of the people, the parliament, presented Charles with the Petition of Right, very, very important document. And the Petition of Right, excuse me, there's a mosquito there. The Petition of Right was it's just that. It's a petition. It's asking. It's saying, please, would you acknowledge the rights of the English people, which have been recognized ever since the days of Magna Carta back in 1215. Well, Charles agreed to the Petition of Right. Then he fired the parliament that brought it to him. Eventually, the relationship comes to a boiling point, and there's a civil war in England. And to cut a very long story short, the end of that civil war is Charles is taken in as a prisoner, and he is beheaded. He is the only king of England to be executed, and that's where we end with Charles I. But our story is not yet over. Okay, now we come to the interregnum. And what's the interregnum? It's simply a word that means between the kings. And the interregnum is a time of rule, not by a king, not by a monarch, not by someone of royal descent, but by a man named Oliver Cromwell, who rules as Lord Protector of England. And during his reign, he is strongly Protestant. And during his reign or his rule as Lord Protector, the English Navy and the English Army become greatly modernized. He had a real gift for administration, and he picked up very, very quickly on military tactics and understood them quite well, and was very effective in eventually defeating the armies, the Cavaliers under the command of Charles I. Well, Oliver Cromwell passes away, and his son takes his place, Richard Cromwell. But Richard is not made of the same stuff as his dad, and so the Richard, unable to keep England together through force of will like his dad could, resigns. And so there's a period of time when no one is in charge. There is an invasion from Scotland that makes it all the way down to London, and George Monk, who is the leader of this Scottish expedition into England, actually restores Parliament. So there's no king at the moment, but Parliament has been restored. And when you've known nothing but kings and queens for the past several hundred years, you get used to it. And England is, well, you know what, we do need a king. And they send out a request to Charles II, the son of the executed Charles I, to come and reign over England. And he does. More about him in just a moment. Charles II, who's this guy? Well, he was on the run when his dad was leading a civil war in England, and so he was in France when Parliament, after the death of Oliver Cromwell and the disastrous brief interlude with Richard Cromwell, petitioned him and said, "Hey, would you come back and be our king?" He said, "Sure, I'll do that." And a few things about Charles. He was King of England during the bubonic plague outbreak and of 1665, and he was King of England during the Great Fire of 1666. He actually took part in joining a bucket brigade to help extinguish the fire, at least as much as he could. But another important thing about Charles is he remembered the fate of his dad. And Charles hunted down the few surviving people available in England who had a hand in his father's death. These were members of Parliament called the regicides. A regicide, someone who kills a king or a royal monarch. And so Charles had some of the remaining regicides brought to trial and executed. So what goes around comes around sometimes. And that's it for Charles. Now we move on to his brother James. Well, okay, now James II. And James II comes to the throne after the death of his brother Charles II. And so, but there's a difference with James. James is avowedly Catholic. So Catholic that he wants to make sure the rest of England is Catholic also. And so he begins a persecution of English Protestants that is extremely unpopular among the English. So Parliament, they did try to resist his rise to the throne, and that failed. But a real concern came about when he marries a Catholic wife and has a child, and it looks like England is going to be forcibly Catholic for the indefinite future. The Parliament sends out another King Wanted request, and this time it is to William of Orange. He is Dutch, and he is, in all the complicated relationships of European royalty, the nearest Protestant relative eligible for the English throne. And so William is invited to England by Parliament to bring an army to overthrow James II. And so William's army arrives at Torbay in the south of England, and James' army simply drops their weapons and they run for it. James takes that as a bad sign and takes off to France, and he does attempt feebly to reinvade England and to take over, but it really doesn't come to anything. For all intents and purposes, James is out, and William and his wife Mary are in. So this is William the Third and his wife Mary the Second, who are now the joint rulers of England. Have you ever heard of William and Mary College? Have you ever heard of Williamsburg, Virginia? Well, guess who they're named after? And those two are important for, well, you'll find out why in just a moment. William and Mary, I was kind of getting a little ahead of myself in the last segment and was already going to tell you their whole story, but I remembered I need to change the scene in the background to keep your interest. Okay, now William and Mary, they're important for a very, very big deal reason, and that is that by the time they come to the throne, Parliament has passed not the English petition we're asking, please, would you respect our rights? No, they have passed the English Bill of Rights. Now, this English Bill of Rights in principle, and sometimes almost portions of it word for word, come into our Constitution. And the Bill of Rights says that William and Mary must respect the rights of Englishmen, or Parliament will withhold the crown from them. This is a huge difference from the days of Charles I. Parliament is absolutely in charge, and they have absolutely come down in favor of a limited government where kings and queens have power but not absolute power, and they have to respect a document that in turn respects the rights of English citizens. And these are very, very big and important stepping stones to our Constitution. We're back here with Old Glory in the background, and for a good reason. If these events did not transpire in English history, this flag might not exist. In fact, it wouldn't. We've already gone over something of the importance of Magna Carta in a previous chapter, and as we look through these events that we've just quickly skimmed over, you saw the English Petition of Right, you saw the English Bill of Rights, and during this time, in 1620, there is an expedition to colonize North America, and a small ship that you'll recall is the Mayflower is on its way across the Atlantic. It gets blown off course in a storm, and it's going to land in territory where no English company claims jurisdiction. Long story short, that means they have to come up with their own government. They create the Mayflower Compact, which is a paragraph long. It would take you 30 seconds to read it. And it simply says essentially this, that we are empowering ourselves to create a government to which we voluntarily submit. And in that little paragraph written in 1620 is so much of American history. Because from the Mayflower Compact, we move on to the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut not too long afterward, and eventually on down the road, we have some men meeting in 1789 in Philadelphia who know their history. They certainly know their English history. All of them were born English citizens, and they put together a government founded on the principles of limited government, representative government, government by the consent of the governed. And that is the story of America.